And we're going to finish The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This section was called Henry Jekyll's accounting of the case. I keep forgetting. Called Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. And he's told how he went to Lanyon as Hyde because he transformed. He was sitting in the park thinking nice thoughts and all of a sudden turned evil, and he'd already murdered a guy, so he had to run around the street like a crazy person until he figured out what to do, stayed in a hotel, etc. So we begin to wrap up what Henry Jekyll has to say about what happened. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change. And I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took, on this occasion, a double dose to recall me to myself, and alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had to be re-administered. In short, from that day forward, it seemed only by a great effort, as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened, under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I now condemned myself, even beyond what I had thought possible to man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak beneath the body and mind, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, a soul boiling with causeless hatreds, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll it was a thing of vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature that had shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the most poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish, but inorganic. This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, and what was dead and had no shape should usurp the offices of life. And this again, that the insurgent horror was knit to him, closer than a wife, closer than an eye, lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and felt it struggle to be born, and at every hour of weakness, and in the confidence of slumber, prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was of a different order. His terror of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide and return to his subordinate station of a part instead of a person. But he loathed the necessity, he loathed the despondency into which Jekyll had now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he was himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. And indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. But his love of life is wonderful. I go further, I, who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him, when I recall the abjection and passion of this attachment, and when I know how he fears my power to cut him off by suicide, I find it in my heart to pity him. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me to prolong this description. No one has ever suffered such torments. Let that suffice. And yet Even to these habit brought, no, not alleviation, but a certain callousness of soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, but for the last calamity, which has now fallen, and which has finally severed me from my own face and nature, my provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out with a fresh supply and mixed the draught. The ebullition followed, and the first change of color, not the second. I drank it, and it was without efficacy, and it was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole how I have had London ransacked. It was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was that unknown impurity which lent efficacy to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. This, then, is the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts, or see his own face, now how sadly altered in the glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end, for if my narrative has hitherto escaped destruction, it has been by a combination of great prudence and great good luck. Should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it, Hyde will tear it to pieces, but if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumspection to the moment will probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spirit, and indeed the doom that is closing on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue that hated personality, I know how I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening to pace up and down this room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is to follow concerns another than myself. Here, then, I lay down the pen, and proceed to seal up my confession. I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. And that is the end of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I enjoyed reading quite a bit, and I hope you enjoyed listening. I think that maybe this time next year I will read you Treasure Island. But now this book is going to go back on the shelf, and it'll be a while before I start another book because I'm going on vacation. But in the meantime, besides checking out Multiverse of Geekdom's series of videos of Frankenstein, you should look at Mary Ellen Katz's walkthrough of the video game Fran Bow on Mary Ellen Katz's YouTube page. And I will see you in the funny papers.